But if we look at the actual losses from thunderstorms and tornadoes over the past 30 years, we see a sharp increase, particularly from last year. We just had a terrible year for severe thunderstorms and tornadoes in the U.S. Is that due to climate change? Uncertain at this point. When you look at all the disaster studies, the loss studies that have come out in the last decade, the majority of them still say there's too much noise and not enough signal as far as climate change goes to tell if disaster losses are increasing due to climate change. Yes, they are increasing, but that could be primarily due to increases in wealth and population. And as far as the future goes, here I'm plotting a model study which tracks what might happen to severe thunderstorms by the year 2100. It shows that for a few cities in the U.S., we might see an increase in severe thunderstorms by 2100, but that's not the case for all cities. Chicago looks like it's not going to change much. New York City, we might see an increase in severe thunderstorms. Still too early to tell at this point what might happen to severe weather in the future. One thing I can tell you from watching this summer's severe thunderstorms, when you have more heat in the atmosphere, you can get a stronger thunderstorm, which generates strong winds that we saw in the derecho event that hit from Chicago to Virginia last Friday, a week ago Friday. When you have intense heat, you will get severe thunderstorms, but you need a strong jet stream as well to generate tornadoes, and that's something we haven't had, fortunately, in these severe thunderstorms we've had this winter. Now, real quick, I'm going to go through a list of what I see in the next 30 years as the potential greatest sorts of expensive disasters we might see internationally. And I'm going to start right away with Tampa Bay. Let's hope we don't get a Tampa Bay hurricane this year during the last week of August, which is when the Republican National Convention is scheduled in the city of Tampa, down at sea level. But I think I'm giving probabilities here for the next 30 years of what sort of odds there would be of a $100 billion disaster in each of these locations. So next 30 years, I'm thinking a 20% chance of a Tampa Bay hurricane that would do $100 billion in damage. Now, I'll show a quick storm surge plot here of what would happen to the Tampa Bay area. You can see that St. Petersburg would become an island, and right where I have that white dot that says Tampa, that's where the Republican National Convention is this fall. It would be under about 15 feet of water. Going on to Japan, we've got 3 potential tracks that could bring a $100 billion typhoon into Japan. There hasn't ever been more than a $15 billion typhoon in Japan, but we could certainly get something like that in the next 30 years. Going over to China, they have a history of some very bad floods there. There was a $30 billion flood in the 1990s there. It's not out of the question that we could get a even more significant flood there in the coming decades. Galveston, Houston, a huge concern area for the U.S. because so much of the infrastructure of the oil and gas industry is there. They have been hit by several Category 4 hurricanes, most recently in 1915. If one of those were to recur, it would be a $100 billion disaster. Miami, also highly vulnerable to a major hurricane. If we had a repeat of the 1926 hurricane, again, a $100 billion plus disaster. New Orleans, if we have a repeat of Katrina, but if it hits a little bit farther to the west, it will overwhelm the levees. Even though they're designed for a Category 3 storm, they can't handle a Category 4 or stronger storm. And I think a 30% chance that we'll see New Orleans levees get breached again sometime in the next 30 years. China with drought is a big concern, particularly since they're fairly rich and have a lot of people. If they do have a huge drought and can't feed their people, they're going to buy a lot of grain from the world market. Grain prices are going to spike, and you're going to see a lot of problems with food riots and political unrest globally if we do have a Chinese drought. Thinking about hurricanes again, New York City, we had a strong tropical storm named Irene hit the city last year, doing $15 billion of damage. Imagine if that were to be a hurricane, we could easily get a $100 billion price tag from one of those, particularly since if we look at the New York City financial district, well, there's only a 5-foot high seawall protecting the heart of New York City, and that means at high tide it's only about 2.5 feet above the water level. So a hurricane coming into New York City, even if it's a Category 2 like I'm showing here, a relatively weak storm, you could get a 20-foot storm surge into New York City, which would be very expensive for the U.S. Keep in mind, New York City's got 10% of the U.S. GDP. There have been a few storm surge disasters in New York City. Here's LaGuardia Airport underwater due to a nor'easter. Here's a train station in Hoboken underwater during another nor'easter. And here's a model forecast of what Hurricane Irene could have done last year had it not fallen apart and moved over so much land. This is a Category 4 forecast of this storm hitting New Jersey. We're extremely lucky that didn't happen back in 2011. Going over to California now. Now we're thinking of flooding there. There's a study out that shows that were a repeat of this 1800s flood to occur in California, it could do $700 billion of damage, and I think there's about a 20% chance we'll see a flood like that over the next 30 years. Okay, let's look towards what's happening right now in the center of the U.S. We've got drought conditions developing. Drought in the Midwest U.S. has been responsible in the past for 2 of the 3 most expensive disasters in U.S. history. And it's a sure bet, well, I'm giving 50% here, that we'll see something like that in the next 30 years. And I'm quite concerned about the levels of drought we're seeing this year in the Midwest. Particularly since we saw from the Russian drought of 2010, it caused a huge spike in global food prices. We may see something similar to this if the Midwest drought continues the way it looks like it's going to unfold this summer. If you look back at 1988, the last time we had a major Midwest U.S. drought, you can see in red colors here the drought areas based on what's called the Palmer Drought Index. Now if you look at the forecast for 30 years from now coming from climate models, looks very similar to that. And this is kind of the typical weather we expect 30 years from now. Drought is going to become much more common, wildfires are going to be much more common, and it's going to be a huge expense to the American economy if we get more summers like this one. Let's think a little bit about flooding now. The Mississippi River is held in place by a structure created by the Army Corps of Engineers. If the Mississippi were to go past this structure, or the structure were to fail, and letting the river carve a new path to the Gulf of Mexico, that would be a massive disaster on a scale like we can't imagine. We came a little uncomfortably close to seeing that happen last year when the Mississippi set an all-time flow record in the lower portion in Louisiana. And with climate change, we've seen a large increase in heavy precipitation events over the last 30, 40 years. In particular in the Midwest, you can see there's been a 31% increase in these sorts of most dangerous flooding type rainfall events, and in the Northeast 67%. So heavy rainfall events are increasing, our flood danger is increasing, and you're going to start seeing a lot more property losses due to flooding in the coming 30 years. You can read through, if you want, a short description of some of the impacts if the Mississippi were to change course due to a flood. The big one I see here is you lose all the barge traffic going up and down the Mississippi, and that's 60% of all U.S. grain exports. Think about what that would do to global food prices. Finally, I'm giving number 1 spot here to if we have a huge volcano blow, we could really see some major impacts. I don't know how the insurance industry would deal with this, but there have been cases in the past, particularly back in 1815. You can see that blue arrow down there when Mount Tambora blew in 1815. It created the year without a summer the next summer, causing a famine and failure of global food stocks in both Europe and North America. So hope we don't see something like that in our lifetimes. Maybe global warming is doing us a favor by keeping us out of one of these volcanic winters in the future. We'll see. So that's all I have for now, and I'm going to turn it over to the next speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Masters. The fascinating overview of past and future. In your experience, I mean, you travel around, I think, and do you see firsthand these disasters as well? And what have you observed over the course of your career any impressions you'd like to share?
I used to fly with the hurricane hunters, and certainly I flew into a number of very strong Category 4 and 5 storms. And the thing that kind of blows my mind about hurricanes right now is that hurricane damages are doubling every 15 years, even though the incidence of hurricanes hitting the U.S. has not increased. So that's strictly due to vulnerability of the coastlines, more people moving there, more development, and so on. So hurricanes are going to be a huge problem going forward, that's for sure.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that overview, and I think now we'll move on to talk to Michael Simon.